Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the C.G.Jung Helpdesk Meetup Group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
Thank you all for coming for this new event that I've done basically 2 years ago. So some old timers know it maybe. There I talked already about complexes, but I wanted to do the topic again because it's very central to Jungian psychology. And it's so central to Jung that his brand of psychology, analytical psychology, he sometimes called also complex psychology, not because it's so complex, well, it is complex in its complexity, but because it is centered very much around this psychological entity of the complex. And this started for Jung very early when he began his studies, and even before when he tried to think about the things that he could study, because he was always interested in nature, but also culture, history, and archaeology. He wanted to be an archaeologist for quite some time. And he encountered in his early studies a book about psychology, which he had absolutely no interest in, psychology as a topic, because he had also psychologists in his family. His father had something to do with it, so he was automatically not interested. But there he read an introduction and was completely captivated and said, oh, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to find out about the things that are happening inside of people that makes them cry when they don't want to cry, that makes them laugh when they don't want to laugh. And this is like a red thread through his whole work and his whole life. Because when we talk about complexes, most things people know are like the father or the mother complex, which is integral to psychoanalysis, which is Freud and Jung worked together with Freud for a long time. And it was the research of Freud that brought Jung into contact with him. And this was all based on the complex, all based on something that is autonomous in the psyche and is kind of unconscious. We're not sure what is happening to us. And it is bodily in a sense that it causes certain reactions within us. For example, this Freudian slip that we spill a secret by misspeaking, or that we're laughing at the wrong thing, or that we have a thought that takes possession of us, that we can't let go. It just follows us around like a bad ghost. Or already being in love can be described as a complex. There's suddenly something there that influences us in our consciousnesses, in our daily being and acting, that brings in trouble and creates trouble. So this is something that is extremely visible and noticeable when you pay attention. And this is why Jung was interested in it and explored it as the very first thing in his studies, because this is the stuff that people noticed first. Like archetypes, Jung did way later because you need way more background knowledge for that. But for complexes, you can notice in yourself, but also in other people. And I have some quotes from Jung that I would like to read. The complex forms something like a shadow government of the ego. And also, take the classic state of being in love, for example. The lover is obsessed with his complex. His precise interest depends only on this complex and on the things that go with it. Every word and every object reminds him of his beloved. So when we talk about complexes, you have to think about it a little bit like a gremlin, like a separate entity with its own worldview, its own actions, its own agenda, being in the psyche right next to you. So you have your consciousness, you have your ego in the middle of consciousness that perceives, that acts, that does purposefully, diligently. And then you have all these other things around interfering, like a gremlin interferes with a machine, for example. And the main premise of Freud and psychoanalysis, and which is kind of the foundation of psychology as a scientific endeavor, is this idea and realization that you're not master in your own house, that you do not know everything about yourself, that you do not know and realize everything that you do or what you want or why you want it. And an integral part of that is not only that you do not know, but rather that there's something separate, something autonomous, having its own agenda and constantly interfering. And this interference is super interesting in the sense of Jung talked about when somebody has a complex, they're then very often forgetful. They forget certain things at a point, especially things they do not want to think about, or something that they have accidents, that their body is not in their control anymore, that they misstep or slip. And for him, this is really a sign when somebody has a lot of accidents and is clumsy, that their psyche is not a unified thing, but rather there's different forces acting against each other. And they are not in a harmonious, complete being together. And this even affects for him the breathing. He says there's something called a complex breathing. This makes it a little bit unclear when you say complex. It sounds a little bit always like complexity, but breathing caused by a complex, that people tend to breathe very shallow, that they do not use their full lung capacities. He saw there also specific reasons why people get tuberculosis, but this was his little bit weird idea in that regard. But also that people then laugh, that they find something funny because a complex can be hit. It has associations, things connected to it. There are certain words, like hot topic words. Today we would say triggered very often, like a trigger warning for a certain topic that has a highly emotional charge. For example, child abuse or rape or war, trauma, all these things. When you get to know people intimately, you find out how to push their buttons. And there are certain things you can say or do that immediately will kick off certain reactions. And for Jung, this is a complex. For Jung is when somebody is being taken over by an emotion and are kind of trapped then in this emotion. For Jung, that is a complex. And so you have to walk around a little bit like on a minefield, that when you push certain things and go into certain territories, that the complex will come out and it will act and it will take over the person without even necessarily the person knowing this. I know some people who are like this. Like you can bring them to specific topics and they're rattling on for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, and with a high emotional charge. And if you talk later to them and try to remember them what they said, they say, "Oh no, I did not say that. No, I did not mean that. No, that you must be merciful remembering," because it's not their consciousness doing it and they're not aware of it. It's rather than the complex coming out and doing something through them as a kind of meat puppet. So it is kind of second personality that can come out. For Jung, a complex can start very small. It is very often for him a kind of misadaptation. So we have our consciousness, and our consciousness is, let's say, small and fragile, and it's supposed to enlarge over time, that we incorporate more things about ourselves and also the outside world, that become more and more proficient in certain topics. Like mastering a guitar, before it's not possible, but then you do the training and you can do it. Or find a partner, be in a relationship, become a good employee or a good citizen or a good parent. These are things that can be learned and integrated into the personality. But of course, in the beginning, one is nothing of that, right? One has trouble finding a partner. One has trouble to be in a good relationship. One has trouble to be a good parent because one is new at it. Even though that human beings have done this for millions of years, oneself and one's individual life is new to this and needs to learn. And Jung sees this as adaptation. So you are adapted to your internal world, like the things, emotions, for example, that come out, but also the external world where you have social structures and other people that you need to kind of accommodate. And consciousness, as I said, is small, limited, and needs to grow, but that does not mean that all the growth is only happening in consciousness, but rather a complex can be formed that then acts on the person. And the easiest example is in childhood. So when you have the education of a child, a lot of is centered around inducing complexes in the child. It does not necessarily understand why something is forbidden or why it should do something, but rather it kind of gets off ingrained by the parents into the psychology of the child. It's just later that it starts to understand why certain things are done. But first, it's important that a child knows what to do and not what to do, not necessarily to understand it, because it might not have the capacity yet to understand it. But this is the first form of complex that is already there. Freud talked about this a lot. His idea of superego is that the values and rules of the society are ingrained into the child through the parents as the superego that is always there as a kind of moral instance that separates the good from the bad, coming from the it, like what is socially desirable and what is not. So Jung does not have this idea of the superego, but he has also this idea of the things being ingrained by the parents. So complexes themselves are not necessarily negative. They are just like a splintered off part that should be integrated into consciousness with time, because there is something there. There's certain emotions, certain associations that should be part of consciousness and should be then done in a deliberate manner. It's not only important to know what not to do, but rather also to understand why. Why is it important? Why does it rule exist? And this is then what happens later in life, like in puberty, that suddenly all these things that children just learned get questioned. And this has just a reason to incorporate into consciousness, because that allows for further complexity. Because a rule is really just a rule. It's binary, it's yes or no. But the world is way more complex. Like things can be yes or no dependent on the situation. So to gain this complexity, it needs to be reflected, and that happens then later in life. The problem is when a complex does not get integrated. So Jung says a complex is completely normal. We are constantly filled with complexes, which is not a negative thing. It's just something that's already there, like bacteria that you have in your gut. But there's like positive bacteria or negative bacteria. And the question in regards to complexes is how you approach it. If you are avoidant and do not want to touch that, or if you're proactive and try to integrate it. Because if you ignore it and suppress it, it will stay in the unconscious. And there it will gather and foster. A little bit like cancer, let's say. It will start sucking up resources. And what in the beginning was just like a simple behavior, like the picture that Chris has shown, might develop to full-fledged second personality, like this shadow government that Jung mentioned in his quote, that you suddenly content with something that is more complex than a normal behavior, but rather really complete worldview, like an entity that you can interact with, as Warren said, how he does it in active imagination, which is also something that Jung advised and said about when you encounter beings in your dream. Those beings are always part of your psychology, as dreams are super subjective. It's only your psychology. And that they're being split off is a realistic sign that they're a complex that you then can interact with, of course, ideally. So, for example, when you have the shadow, this is the negative part, the negative, like a photo negative of the conscious personality that gets constellated, gets bigger and bigger. And similar like a cancer, it can suck out the energy, the libido, the energetic force that makes things happen, and takes it away from consciousness. Similar as cancer takes away nutrients and energy from the basically host, the human being. A host is not really the right word, but I guess you understand what I mean, making them weak. And this effect, Jung calls, in a psychological sense, neurosis and depression. The energy is still there, but it's not in consciousness. Like you're tired, you can't do certain things because it's somewhere else. It's growing somewhere else. And there it's still all very active. And you need to go into the really dark places to then find this treasure and integrate it into your psychology to become energetic again and move forward. Because all of that is the future you. So you have a consciousness, which is now, but the real complete personality and complete being is in the background as an unconscious thing. And Jung calls that the self, like everything you could do and every facets of the personality you can have and should have is in the background. And his view is that we are traversing life, gathering all these pieces, these bits and pieces, and integrating them. And not integrating them creates problems. And so how can we know that this is really the future you and the way how we should develop just because we have a complex that makes us trip or breathe badly? His idea is that the reason for many complexes are instincts coming from the collective unconscious or human nature and trying to manifest themselves outside. And instincts are associated with archetypes, and archetypes is like the collective knowledge that we have, the situations that happened over such a long time and so often that they're ingrained in our psychology. And every human being is born with them, and every human being will be born with them in the future also. Where we have again a big difference between Freud and Jung, as when we talk about the mother or father complex, Freud would say, you have a mother or father complex because of the behavior of your specific mother or your specific father. So things that they have done to you that are positive or negative have an influence even on you for many years as an unresolved issue inside of you. But Jung says this goes deeper, as mothers and fathers are not rediscovered by every baby, but rather every baby already knows what a mother and father is, that there's already this archetype, this understanding what it means to be a father or mother or to have a father or a mother, that there's specific behavior and action expected. And this then comes out like the collective knowledge of humanity is pushing constantly onto our temporal consciousness in our present day. So the eternal is pressing against the very timely now. And this expresses itself through archetypes, but also then emotions. And for Jung, the core of a complex is emotional. As I said about these booby traps that you can have in the psychology of other people when you talk about a specific topic, for example, money or competence or height or whatever, right? You can see this really a lot online, that people immediately start rambling off and they have a kind of script that they go through. And it's completely automatic. It's not something that they've necessarily chosen, but this is that is inside of them and it's unresolved. So there's potential for their future development there, but they're not really using it yet. And Jung calls a complex even a mousetrap, in the sense of when you let people talk freely for long enough, their attention will drift from time to time to these topics of complexes. So this is why in psychoanalysis and also analytical psychology and therapy, the therapist lets the patient talk as much as possible, because the therapist will notice that suddenly talking about a specific topic will cause an emotion to rise up in the patient, or that there's something they do not want to talk about, that they then forget, that they kind of hit a mental roadblock. This is also typical complex behavior, that people suddenly forget what they wanted to say, like it's completely gone blank. This is also then a potential sign that a complex got activated by a certain idea of thought running in the background, because it is a triggering of the complex through specific stimuli that then take over the, let's say, whole mechanism. You're suddenly distracted. You're suddenly thinking about something else. You suddenly have a thought you cannot shake and it does not let go. Going back to the idea that you're not master in your own house. So, of course, in a complex, then it's a second personality. It can take over, and it, as I said, when you do not take care, it can become worse and worse and worse and worse. So it can bring life of the patient or the person to a standstill, that they can basically can't do anything until it is brought to light and talked about and reflected. This was this is why it's called a talking cure, because Jung says when you have a complex and it's in the unconscious, this is where complexes live, it's always fresh there. It's always like it just happened. So a trauma or traumatic experience also causes a complex. It creates something complicated in your psychology, that you cannot do certain things anymore, that you're afraid of certain situations or words or smells or anything. And when it is in the unconscious, it's frozen in time. And it's like a wound that never closed. So every time it's touched, it's like it was just created. And this is why Jung said it needs to be brought to light, because in light, it can be processed through consciousness and transformed in something else. This is a huge part in Jungian psychology, the transformation of things, even when they seem negative and bad, and I don't want to deal with this, I don't want to touch it, that there's value there that can be transformed and bring a kind of redemption or release for the individual person. And this is why I chose the quote for this event about, as we know, a complex can be really overcome really only if it is lived out to the full. In other words, if we are to develop further, we have to draw to us and drink down to the very dredges because of the complexes we have held at a distance. And it's really that, to actively engage the complexes, even though that's painful, to go in the very dark places and bring out what is there. Because even though it's painful and it means living out a complex is really to bring out everything and live it out. So to do the things you're really afraid about, that you've been running away from the whole time, this brings transformation. And this develops the person. This idea of the emotion complex is, by the way, idea from Jung that's also in psychoanalysis with Freud. So a lot of ideas in psychoanalysis started with Jung in concert with Freud, of course. But yeah, it's something that Jung never let go of, I mean. So in the past, these complexes, they existed, of course, but the word is new. And that's very specific to Jung, and not many people know what is meant with a complex. But there were names for that. And people just called it differently. They said that somebody is possessed by a ghost or a devil or a demon, that you feel that the other person is being taken over by something. It's gripped by an emotion, gripped by thought, an idea that they're kind of possessed, but also involuntarily. In Germany, we have this saying that we say, oh, I don't know what devil wrote him. That there is something, an entity being active, causing things inside the person that they might not even be aware of. As I mentioned, this, maybe you also made this experience. There are some people, when they really get going and are completely in an emotional state, that they will afterwards deny that they were so emotional first, and second, all the things that they have said. So this is something to look out for. For Freud, complexes were also integral, very integral, because for him, the human psychology centers around the incest complex. So Jung wrote a lot of criticisms about Freud and psychoanalysis, even though that he worked in the beginning with Freud. Furthering the field of psychoanalysis, they had a split regarding some really fundamental things. And in his later life, he criticized a lot of the approaches. And he said, one approach for psychoanalysis, according to the Freudian system, is this digging for complexes. So it's this a priori idea that there's an incest complex inside all human beings. And because they do not acknowledge it, they suffer for it. So this is for Jung, I want to emphasize this. The Freudians back then, I can't say how it is today, tried to break through resistances, what they called resistances, to get the person to kind of confess their incest complex. And Jung did not really like this approach, because he said people can not be aware of the complexes. This is also one big difference. For Freud, everything first had to be conscious, discarded by the superego, and going into the unconscious. So everything was conscious first. But Jung says you can have things that are completely unconscious. For example, archetypes, they are completely unconscious from the beginning, and then they come up and push. And only then their effects can become conscious. And interestingly, Freud said complexes can be bound. So when you have the right word for a complex, that this drives away the complex. A little bit like the fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin, I think is the English one, where you have this young girl that basically makes a deal with the devil, and she's about to be taken away, and she has to guess the name of this entity. And she finds out the name, and this makes it poof, disappear. And Freud saw it also this way. So there's a letter from Jung and Freud where Freud is basically saying, oh, what are the neurotics going to do once we found all the names for all the complexes? So to have this magic word that makes the complex disappear. Of course, it did not become true, this prediction, but it's just interesting to see how different really greats of psychology thought about this. And Jung investigated complexes before knowing that complexes exist, because Jung always looked at things happening. He looked at phenomena and then later tried to understand why they're happening. And there's some super interesting research from him. It's called the association experiment, and that made Jung pretty famous. So today, close to no one knows about it. I also did not know about it. There's a whole book in the collected works about it. It's pretty thick and it's very dry because it's full of tables. But this made Jung famous in America before Freud. So Jung was more famous than Freud in the beginning because of the association experiment. And what did he do? He would sit down people and he will start to recognize all the things that he later talked about in these early experiments, where you have to keep in mind he had no idea what was happening. He just was seeing that there was something happening. So he would sit down people and he would give them stimuli words. They would give them a word like family, father, money, son, 200s of them, and get a reaction from the person. They would say the first thing that just pops into their mind, like family, son, weather, whatever. And he would write down all the words, but he would also write down the time that it took the person to say them, because he noticed something very interesting. So he had his list of 200 words, go through them with the patient, and immediately afterwards, he would do the same thing again, the same 200 words, same order, everything. But he noticed that for the biggest part, the reaction words were the same, but sometimes not. And interestingly enough, always where there was the longest reaction time. So he had a very accurate watch. He was Swiss in Switzerland. So of course he had access to very accurate watches. And he noticed that people could not remember the reaction words for the words that took the longest to say. So with this idea of complexes in mind, a complex got hit. So immediately the person is distracted and then something is being said, but it's not said by the person, but rather by the complex, by a psychic entity doing something autonomously in the psyche. And he became very sophisticated in that. He started to look into personality, also relationships, like what are the reaction words between a mother and a daughter, for example, and how does it develop once the daughter is married away to her husband. And so the book is super interesting, but it's also incredibly dry. And he would later also include using the conductivity, the electric conductivity of the skin. So yeah, Jung laid the foundation for the lie detector, which is also then super interesting because the lie detector is also that you ask the person something and you see what the measurement says, how they are reacting. It was first that he had this research and he could not explain it. He was not sure what was happening there. And then he got into contact with Freud and psychoanalysis and the idea of the unconscious, and there also with complexes. And he said, Freud proves what I see here. And this is how they came together and formed this friendship that lasted for 6, 7 years, with all the fallout that happened then at the end. But yeah, this is all where it started for Jung, and you can trace it then basically if you go further and further, as I said, with a complex being triggered by instinct and then also by archetypes into the deeper parts of the psyche and the later works of Jung. So there's certain topics he never lets go of. He develops them, he brings them into a broader and wider context. But this is then Jung thinking and elaborating on complexes over 60 years. All right, that would conclude my presentation part, and I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope you learned something, and you maybe had even a little bit of fun. This would conclude the first part, and now comes the second part. And I think, and I hope that was my plan, to incorporate somehow all the things that you said in regards to complex before. Yeah, so thanks.
This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. During an event, a discussion part follows after the presentation where all attendees discuss the just presented topic or other Jungian concepts. If you also want to join, find the group on meetup.com. The name of the group is C.G.Jung Help Desk. Also make sure to subscribe to the podcast on the platform of your choice. See you next time.